I'd just like to tell you right at the beginning that when I started preparing for the presentation, I realized that I should have done it in a workshop mode because there's a lot of procedure involved in this, but by then it was too late to make any change, so I've kept it as a talk, but please feel free to ask me any questions if you want, if the procedure is not clear. This was a study I carried out with my own students, and these are students in the MA course. The MA course is for a course in English, but they opt for an option course, ELT. And these are students whose background is essentially literature because they passed their BA with English honors. And all through their education career, and I'm speaking here for the majority, they have had exposure to English from explanation by the teacher. They have been introduced to the literary texts through their teachers' interpretation, and they have had very little opportunity to engage with the text firsthand. In addition to this, the examination system being what it is, they are asked to attempt essays, and it's possible for them to answer these essays reading the bazaar notes, which are actually simplified answers. Now, because these bazaar notes are of their level, they are never stretched to go beyond their existing level of reading, to read anything beyond that. And this is the context, and they have very little experience of engaging with the text firsthand. Now, when they come to the ELT option paper, they have to do a lot of reading. They have to do a lot of reading because they have to come to class and engage in discussion. Now, and they find it extremely difficult. So what happens as a result is that they are assigned these reading assignment homework. They come to class, they have nothing to say, the teacher raises the issues, and the teacher offers solutions. So what happens in class is just a modified form of teacher explanation, but in a different format. And this obviously was very frustrating for me. So this was my problem, how to make the students of my class read, and especially to read research articles. Specifically, my focus was how to make them read. And then I found from my study of literature a particular procedure called reciprocal teaching, and I wanted to see whether reciprocal teaching would work in this context. And finally, would it really help them read and make them autonomous? Because I was looking at two things. One thing, is the procedure all right for the class? Will it work procedurally in the class? And in the process, would they be more interested in reading and eventually be agreeable to be more autonomous? So this was my question with which I started the study. Now, just to tell you a little bit about reciprocal teaching. Reciprocal teaching is not a new concept. Some of you might be very well familiar with it, so forgive me for explaining it. But this is a procedure, actually, which was given by Palinsker and Brown, and subsequently taken up by many people. In fact, if you click on the YouTube, you'll find several classrooms following reciprocal teaching. But I haven't seen one using older learners like my students were. And what it does is that it kind of forces the students to focus on both cognitive as well as metacognitive strategies. Makes them focus on questioning, clarifying, summarizing, and then finally making prediction. And in the process of doing this, they are looking at their own reading process. So they are monitoring their comprehension as well. So reciprocal teaching is both comprehension fostering and comprehension monitoring. So it has the dual role, so focusing on both cognitive as well as metacognitive strategies. And because it leads to better reading comprehension, it is hoped that over a period of time, learners would become autonomous readers. Why did I choose to use it? As I said, the goal of education is student autonomy, and reciprocal teaching seemed to match this goal of student autonomy. That is the goal of education. Now, it starts as a dialogic process. There is scaffolding, and the scaffold is withdrawn, and then students take over and eventually become autonomous. This seemed to match the goal of teacher education that we had both in the syllabus as well as my personal agenda as a goal, and that's why I chose reciprocal teaching. This was the procedure that I followed. It was an intact class, no change was done into the class. There were 35 students, and each class was of 1 hour duration. This was spread over 8 hours, so a total of 8 hours duration. And I used 2 articles for their reading. These 2 articles happened to be the articles which they had to read anyway during that particular course at that point of time. Now, point that I'm trying to make is that I made no change to the class setup, neither in terms of the student arrangement nor in terms of the materials used. These just happened to be the texts they would have read at that point of time. And both these articles were from the same book, and it was a book which was also a prescribed textbook. And there is no simplification of material for obvious reasons. I mean, the whole purpose is to make them read independently. So there is no question of any simplification of material. So everything remained the same. The only change was the intervention with reciprocal teaching. To begin with, what I did was, I took up the first article, that is Rod Ellis' Consciousness Raising on Teaching of Grammar, that particular one. I started with activation of background knowledge to check what is their perception about the teaching of grammar. So I started with a question like, what do you think is the role of grammar in language learning? Now, we had to have this discussion to set the scene, to ensure that we were all on the same page before we went further. And then what I did was, I told them that they have to imagine that we are one group, that I was the group leader, and they were members of the group, and they had to follow what I was doing carefully because they would have to take over from me. So I was the leader. I would first ask them a question, and I would then follow certain things, and they have to do 2 things simultaneously. They would be reading, and they would also be watching the procedures that I am adopting. Because notice that there's a loop that I'm talking about here, because these are students of teacher education, which means they must learn how to read, but they must learn how to be teachers. So they had to pay attention to the procedure as well as the reading. So what I did was, I started by asking them a question based on the 2 paragraphs that I had asked them to read. So I asked them a question, and obviously no one answered the question. And I tried to figure out the answer to the question. I tried to build the answer to the question. And then I asked them, I pretended not to understand some parts of those 2 paragraphs. And I told them to clarify those for me. Now, notice that they had done just 1 reading. And they didn't know I would be asking them these things. I mean, these are things I realized in hindsight. So they were actually not prepared to explain things to me. So again, I took over, and I tried to figure out the meanings of the areas which were not clear to me. So what I did, I kind of modeled the clarifying process. So I would read, and then I would go back, I would go forward, and I would kind of do a mental modeling to show them how I was clarifying it to myself. And then I summarized the 2 paragraphs for them. And finally, I made a prediction about what would come next, possibly come next. So these are the 4 steps I followed. I questioned, I clarified, I summarized, and I made prediction. And then, of course, the first class was over, so I gave them the 3 paragraphs for homework, the next 3 paragraphs for homework. The next day, I started discussing these 3 paragraphs. Now, this just happened spontaneously. I didn't plan to discuss the paragraphs because the whole idea is for them to apply the strategies to understand those paragraphs. But I was not very confident that they had understood enough to go beyond that. So in order to help them, for me to understand how well they had understood, I had a small discussion based on the 3 paragraphs. And then I understood that there were problems. But I let them go. So I divided them into groups of 4. And in each group, I selected 1 leader. And of course, I made each leader tell me what they would do. And they knew their roles very clear. The role was to ask questions, ask for clarification, summarize, and then make prediction. And then they were to switch roles in those groups of 4. Once they started, I just went around. And I'm sorry, I went ahead. So I went around as they were doing this, and it was very slow going. And nobody was keeping to their role. What was happening was everyone was trying to help the other because they saw themselves as a team. And it didn't matter what role, what the teacher, the leader was supposed to do. Everyone started doing the leader's role, whoever could. And I was so tempted to get in, to help, to explain, and it was difficult holding myself back. But I had to intervene quite a lot because I had to summarize for them, because they were finding summarizing very difficult to do. And that class, I was not very happy with what happened in that class. So I went back home, some more reading and some modification. And fortunately for me, I was able to find a modified procedure, which I used the next day. Now, in the next day, what I did was, this was a procedure based on Dyer, and what I did was, it was again in groups of 4. These were totally new paragraphs, because those 3 paragraphs were complete the previous day. 2 new paragraphs, and they had to, each had to have a card. I had this card in a group. Instead of there being 1 leader, what I had was, each had a role. So 1 person was a questioner, 1 was a clarifier, 1 was a summarizer, and 1 was a predictor. And then they were supposed to switch roles for the next paragraph. This is what they were supposed to do. And what I did was, I had this spur of the moment decision. I said, make notes on your reading based on the role that you want to do. And they started making notes, and I think that helped them. And then they started working on this, and what happened was, this is what they did, which I just told you. Each following his or her role, asking question, making clarification, summarizing, and then making prediction. And then for the next paragraph, another set of students. What I did at the end of this was to ask them comprehension questions. This is one thing I forgot. This is a prompt I had given them right at the beginning. As you read, ask yourself these questions. These are comprehension monitoring prompts. Do I understand? Because I told you earlier that I was looking at both cognitive as well as metacognitive strategies. So monitoring their comprehension to see, do I understand? Is there something I don't understand? Am I sure I'm understanding it well? Are the questions they had to ask. And what I did was, I had this written in a piece of card, which I took, and I was going around the class, I showed. So it was kind of a reminder to them, am I doing it or not? And then, during the first class, I just wrote my notes as I was going around. But from the subsequent class, I recorded the session. Now, when I recorded, because the audio quality was not very good, I was able to record a few groups. So basically, I recorded particular groups rather than all the groups together. And then, after they answered their comprehension questions, I evaluated the success of the comprehension questions, or the answers to the comprehension questions, by seeing how many students were able to answer, How close to the accurate answers these were? These were the two criteria I used to evaluate success. I did not look at the accuracy of language for obvious reasons. That was not my goal anyway. And then, at the end of the semester, which is not at the end of the 8 hours, but at the end of the semester, they were given an end semester questionnaire, which they anyway would have been given, and where there was no specific question about reciprocal teaching, but they talked about it. I'll tell you a little later. So to begin with, the classroom procedures, at the end of the 8 hours, comprehension questions, at the end of the semester, questionnaire. And what are the things I found? I found that there was like, I'm not counting day 1, because day 1, I start from day 3, on the 3rd hour actually, because that's the time when they started answering questions. So when I compared their responses on day 3 with the responses on day 8, there definitely was an improvement. There was an improvement in terms of how many students answered, how close the answers were to the accurate answers. And also, apart from the oral questions, what was another important thing I saw was the strategy of questioning. The person who took the role of the questioner, now everybody has had an opportunity to be a questioner by then. These people started questioning in a different way. Initially, their questions were like missing the woods for the trees kind. Sentence 1, so a question from sentence 1. Sentence 2, so a question from sentence 2. This is how they were framing the questions. But at the end of the 8th, by the 7th and 8th day, their questions were far more global in nature. They were looking from whole, they're asking questions based on the whole, and only later going on to the parts. And this also, another thing I found was they were far more tentative. They became confident, especially very teacher-like. I've just written one extract from the transcript. Just notice how teacher-like this is. Especially when some student was not able to cope, the others became very teacher-like in helping the student cope. And they would say like, just read this, you'll understand. It was like they were trying to imitate me, not giving away the answer, but asking them to read something so that they would get the answer from there. The quotation, the portion within the quotation is what the part of the text. So the teacher says, read this and you will understand. And I thought this was wonderful that students in the group paid attention to the weaker student. And then at the end of the session questionnaire, now questions were about different aspects of the course. But there was one question which asked, which procedures did you like best? And believe me, nearly all the students talked about reciprocal teaching. And some other procedures, for example, I said lecture, group discussion, presentation, reciprocal teaching, all different things that we did in class. Which procedure did you like the best? And they seemed to, they didn't know I'm doing anything on reciprocal teaching, and this is not because of that. But they said reciprocal teaching was the best procedure. And then, of course, as I said, they had gained confidence. One problem I found was that they were not able to make good predictions. Something I had found to be a far more effective procedure in some of my earlier classes, not with these students, but with other students in literature class. Whenever I asked students to make predictions, they were far better in making predictions than these students were. Probably it was because they were not familiar with academic kind of writing. It could be because of that. And some of the reasons for success, I think, is that the process was introduced to them very gradually. They got time to get used to it. And the fact that working in group was not a new thing for them. In a lot of my other classes, they worked in group work. So the class dynamics was such that they were able to easily slide into the position of working in group, taking up a role, and conducting themselves according to the role. And I think because there was a conscious need for debugging, so they need to read and search. I told you earlier they had to make notes. So they had particular roles and they had to make notes. And because they had made notes, because they were shown those cards to check their comprehension, they were going back to the text again and again. These are things I have. The last one, and of course, reciprocal teaching will not work if, I won't say not work, probably will not work if the problem of the students is reading problem. Here the problem was not reading problem. They could read, but they couldn't they had problems with comprehension, specifically comprehension of academic texts. So that is why this was just the right place for reciprocal teaching to work well. And what I learned, one of the major assumption behind reciprocal teaching is that students know how to summarize. But I found that my students had huge problem in summarizing. The strategy with which I had to give them maximum help was summarizing. If I had known it, if I had done like Day's summarizing, Brown and Day's summarizing procedure, probably it would have been easier for them to do. But more difficult than this was holding back, not intervening, even when they are making incorrect interpretations. And after a while, they ceased to look at me when I was going around. In the initial classes, if they had doubt, they looked at me, so they wanted me to step in. But after a while, they didn't want me, so I couldn't intervene. So I think the third one, the biggest challenge, was to lead, help, support, and then gradually fade away. And I think this gradually fading away was the most difficult thing to do. And this needs constant practice to be able to do this. So finally, would I say reciprocal teaching worked in my class? Yes. Procedurally, it worked in my class. It would have been more successful if summarization skills were done at the beginning. Did the students show better comprehension? They did show signs of improved comprehension, probably because they went back to the text again and again. And finally, I'm hoping that this made them more autonomous. And so I feel reciprocal teaching has the potential not just to be a good classroom procedure, but also a procedure that would help in teacher development and can be tried at different levels to see how it works there. I've got a list of references here. Should anyone be interested, the transcripts are also with me if anyone is interested. I hope I have kept to the time. Have I? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Susmita.